Hi everyone, welcome to the second episode of Beyond the Elms. Today, we will be interviewing Elizabeth Lee, a current rising sophomore studying international economics at Stanford University. Before entering Stanford last year, Elizabeth was a club head of Branksome's Debate and Public Speaking Club. She has placed at internationally renowned tournaments including Oxford, Harvard, and Stanford WSDC. Beyond her debate achievements, Elizabeth has also published her own book, was a project lead of the Resolve Tournament, a member of U of T's Global Ideas Institute, and a president at Life Education and Growth Association of Canada. Now, she is the chief of staff at the Stanford Debate Society and a highly involved member in Women in Business. So, welcome, Elizabeth. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for accepting our offer. So, we'll jump right into exploring your high school background. So, for students who also wish to aspire to go to Stanford or pursue international economics, are there any courses or extracurricular backgrounds that you think aligned with your current studies?
Yeah, of course. So I'll probably start there with some of the courses, which you might find somewhat obvious. So obviously, economics is a big one. Naturally, like math is really useful for economics in university, especially like learning calculus because multivariable calculus ends up being quite important. Some other subjects that might be more tangentially important, I would assume to be like politics courses if some schools offer that. I don't think Branksome offers it, but I know some other schools might, alongside business, where these might not be directly related, but often teach concepts that are adjacent to international econ. For example, politics teaching the international side of it more, business teaching more microeconomics, which might be relevant as well. Now, in terms of extracurriculars, there's a few obvious ones that, again, that I'm going to name. So, like the International Economics Olympiad, like the Math Olympiad. I know the John Locke Institute has an essay competition where you have to do like research argumentative papers on topics that they're going to give you each year. And there's an economic section for that too, which probably is of some use for your future if you want to learn about international econ. Now, in terms of some other extracurriculars that might be more extracurricular as opposed to academic, I would assume the three that come to mind for many people would be like debate, Model UN, and DECA slash FBLA. And to talk through some of these, I'm less familiar with Model UN and DECA, but my impression would be that Model UN would again target more of the like international aspect of learning international econ, but less of the economic aspect of it, where although I think the way in which you engage and participate in Model UN doesn't necessarily train the same skills you would need in, econ as an academic subject. I think the exposure to the situations of different countries is still relatively useful. And conversely, for DECA, or just sort of business competition, I believe the focus tends to often be more microeconomic focused, whereas international econ tends to have more of a macroeconomic focus. But some of the concepts are still cross-applicable, and it's still useful in that sense. Now, in terms of debates, I might be somewhat biased because it's what I did the most in high school, but I do believe it is the sort of perfect intersection between having the rigor of economics as well as learning about different countries and getting that global perspective, where the content of debate itself is often quite relevant. So, like, just recently I debated a motion, like a topic that was about whether or not India should invest in manufacturing or the service sector. So, looking at which is the best for the economic development of a developing country, but also just beyond the content itself often being sort of econ and IR related. The style of thinking also, I think, is quite useful for economics, not just international economics, just like econ as a whole, where often like debate forces you to think of second or third order impacts, i.e., if we pass a policy or take an action, we should not only think about the most direct consequences of this, but extrapolate like secondary or like third order impacts from that as well, which is often important in economic analysis. It also forces you to be quite precise about cause and effect, which is important in econ, where, for example, if you just assume that one thing causes like a certain outcome in society, the other side might be like, oh, that's not actually caused by this specific policy. It's actually caused by a billion other things. So this policy isn't important. So being precise about why certain things are the precise cause of other effects is quite important. The last thing I want to note is that oftentimes throughout this extracurricular in particular, you often are forced to solve many problems that are actually secretly econ problems in disguise. And what I mean by this is that often you're forced to do like economic analysis, even if it's not explicitly profiled as economics. And an example of this might be I'm plagiarizing my friend here, like shout out to Tejas. For example, like there's a motion about encouraging everybody to take on therapy, even if you might not necessarily think you need it. And one argument might be this doesn't actually, for example, overburden like therapists because when there's more demand for therapists, there's going to be more supply for therapists. And if you actually took economics, you could respond by saying, oh, like this actually doesn't match up very well because um, the supply of therapists is actually quite inelastic, i.e., it's just quite hard to become a therapist. You know, you have to go to like, I don't know, medical school, you have to undergo a lot of training. So the supply doesn't actually respond as fast as demand. So you will overburden like the mental health system. So this isn't actually explicitly about like money or currency or anything like that, but you're forced to make these sorts of like analyses that are relevant to like economic thinking as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm definitely really on board with all of your analysis. I do think for sure, even like right now during the interview, your analytical skills and ability and precision with public speaking does come through for any debater, especially, well, you, because of how engaged you were. And also, this is such a coincidence, but today is actually the day John Locke results come out. Um, so we will be looking at that in a few hours. I do know you got highly commended, so you would definitely have a lot of experience in John Locke and economics. So yeah, then I guess next, more in line with the DP curriculum in general, we can talk a little bit about some tips for DP students, especially because IB is such a rigorous system. So maybe some tips that you learned from being a Branksome student, like how to prepare for high school and the workload, as well as just generally how to stay motivated.
Yeah, of course. So in terms of being more exposed to econ specifically, I'll talk about like more general advice afterwards. I think it's often useful to just look at some basic economics research. So being familiar with, well, not even just economic research, but being more familiar with methods of quantitative research, like analyzing stats. You probably don't need to get like super in depth with this, but just like getting a baseline level of familiarity that when you like see a graph or see some basic like comments on quant research, you're not like just like very intimidated. Having some baseline comfortability with this is quite useful. The other thing in terms of general skills I think are useful to work on is learning to take initiative to develop a work-life balance, which is probably advice many of you have heard before, but it's often especially true in university, where the workload of your day is often something you have a lot of control over. So like in many in many courses or many majors, you have a degree of choice about how much workload you want to take on. And one of two things often happens where people either take on too much workload and they overestimate how much they can achieve, or people oftentimes burn out at the end of high school and then just take on very little workload and do not actually take initiative. Learning how to set that balance early on is often useful to make sure you don't like crash and burn in university in one of these two ways. Oh, also finally, sorry, in terms of staying motivated, I just remembered. I think there's a couple general things that might be useful. So the first is to pick things to focus on that you're actually passionate about. So for example, in economics, if you don't like learning about like currency, don't focus on learning about currency, like learn about other aspects of economics, or like pick like a country that you're very interested in to do more in-depth research in. It's probably cross applicable to other subjects as well. So if you're I don't know, taking like some CS course, you probably want to like apply it in ways that you're interested in, like maybe gaming if you're interested in that. So just trying to do what is necessary academically, but in a way that is most enjoyable to you is useful. And also in terms of being ready for university, I think it's also useful to not put too much pressure on yourself in terms of understanding that for most university courses, they're going to give you the prerequisites that are necessary to have sufficient background knowledge and walk you through it in ways that are reasonable and accessible, even if you don't have like a specialized focus on it in high school. So just understanding that it's not the be all end all if you're not like ready for university at the end of high school, and just making sure you work on like personal skills of how to like manage your own life is probably sufficient, even if you're not like academically necessarily always prepared.
Yeah, some great tips. And I definitely think that all of us will find it very useful. And time management, as well as passion, is definitely very important in terms of spreading out your workload and being actually efficient. Because for me, at least, and I guess a lot of my friends probably relate to this, one thing is that we might overburden ourselves and think that we're doing so much and so much. But after all, each, like the time and value you dedicate to each extracurricular or item becomes like decreases over time, and ultimately that just leads to a lesser outcome than if you had better time management and I guess just you made a better decision beforehand. So yeah, definitely some very great tips. And so now we'll jump into the college aspect then. So, in terms of international economics, is there a specific impetus or a specific course or anything that you would attribute to pushing you to pursue this area in specifically?
Yeah, I think it's the combination of two factors. Where firstly, well, before entering university, I actually thought it was probably going to be like an IR or like poli sci major. And in terms of like content, I was very interested in learning about different countries and how they function, like finding out how, for example, like people across the world might live differently than me or like interact with their political system was something that was fascinating to me from an academic and content perspective. And in terms of economics, like I'd say I'm pretty interested in the content of economics too, but the allure also is of like the skills that it demands in terms of the precise reasoning I was talking about before and the way it's often applied, where oftentimes in many social science courses, like I can't speak on behalf of like the entire like poli sci department, right? But it's for some of the courses that I took in my first year, I often found when reading papers, they would make sort of generalized assumptions where they would pick out one thing and be like, ah, this is what causes like authoritarianism in this country. And it's sort of imprecise in just claiming that there's like a direct corollary effect here. And that type of analysis and type of like skill was not something that was very appealing to me, whereas I found the rigor of economics more appealing. So this is sort of the perfect combination of my interest in IR with like the skills that I enjoyed in econ.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I actually had, like, out of curiosity, in terms of, I guess this is specific to Stanford, but is international economics actually the full degree that you're pursuing, or would it be a minor that's under one or the other?
Yeah, so at Stanford, I know it's different maybe for some schools, but at Stanford specifically, econ is the official major, and within that you have different like concentrations or areas of courses. So international econ is one of the areas. I know, for example, like microeconomics or something more financy would be a different area. But yeah, it's more of a concentration that is sort of unofficial, whereas econ is the official major.
Mm. Yeah, that's definitely really helpful to know. I know some schools do like micro-credentials, certificates, minors, all different types of
Mhm,
names.
yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting. And I guess you touched on this already, but how do you think economics at the college level? It might be a little bit different since you're kind of doing a synthesis of IR and econ, but how does it differ or compare to economics at the high school level?
That's an excellent question. So this is actually something that I like had to think about actively because I was like, oh, maybe I don't have to take Econ 1 because I took DP Econ. I did in fact have to take Econ 1. And the reason as to why it was actually different and more important is that I find that DP Econ, or like probably high school econ in general, tends to be less quantitative. So I know for IB Econ, I took HL Econ. We did predominantly like analysis of theory, so analytically talking about and writing sort of mini essay answers or papers about how one thing would affect like the economy in certain ways, but not really applying like numbers to it. There was like one section that was like about more like mathematical problem solving. I think it's like your second exam in the IB system, and I don't even think it's like something that SL students do. So yeah, the quant focus is significantly less, whereas in university, the quant is way more important, like multivariable calculus, super important, or so I hear. Stanford might actually be one of these schools with an econ major or department that is somewhat less quant focused than maybe other comparable schools, but it's still like a significantly larger focus than it is in high school.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And that was one of the comparisons that I wanted to draw, although I don't have any experience with university economics. I do find that economics resembles more like the humanities or business side at the high school level because a lot of it would be observations and less so on building those skills and stats, especially to read papers or higher level economics in like knowledge in general to access it. So yeah, I definitely agree with that a lot. Then in terms of studying international economics, what would you name as the top skill you need? You already mentioned quantitative and analytical skills, but maybe in addition to that, what do you think is the top skill that one should procure and able to study international economics?
So I mean, analysis is a pretty broad term because I think most majors would require analysis, but I think maybe a specific area of analysis that I haven't mentioned yet is maybe like comparative analysis. So for example, like in comparative politics, for understanding how like the different systems of different countries operate and often pass economic policies, like maybe like the ethnic or socioeconomic makeup of different countries influences how successful economic policies might be, or like whether or not like redistribution is important. But these more soft, more social sciencey factors are quite important. And oftentimes it is not very useful to think about them from a Western lens, and being able to develop a sort of comparative lens of thinking about it from the perspectives of other cultures and countries is useful as well, because these are demographic factors that influence the success of economic policies.
Hmm. So like a multifaceted thinking that quite resembles debate, probably.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Then now we're going to kind of scale back a little bit and go back to just university more in general. So, how are you finding your day-to-day, your course load, or anything that you could describe to us as aspirers not yet in the university system?
Okay, so in terms of the day-to-day, I'd say one might be surprised at how much flexibility you have in university. I mean, this might vary because, Canadian system, like British system might be slightly different. But in the States, and particularly in like a social science major, you have a lot of variability in terms of your course load. So, for example, like at Stanford, we have like the quarter systems. We have winter quarters and spring quarters, like and the autumn quarter. And I had like a significantly heavier winter quarter than a spring quarter, but like I get a lot of choice as to which quarters I want to be heavier. There's also a lot of flexibility with courses that I really appreciate, where like, yeah, I'm studying econ, but I also took like a lot of phil courses. I took some like softer IR courses, and like I took an urban planning course, which is really cool. And even if you're like dying in like mechanical engineering or something, you can probably still take one unit wonders, or which is like lower unit or lower workload courses that allow you to explore different subjects. So for example, social dance is a one unit wonder, which is, pretty cool. You can dance with a partner. Always, a good skill to have. Um, but that degree of flexibility is something that Stanford not only encourages, but actually requires you to have with a small or somewhat loose core requirement. Otherwise, day to day, like it's pretty chill. I'd say it's significantly nicer than high school in terms of the freedom that you actually have.
Okay, so maybe the university dream will come true someday.
Hopefully, hopefully. I believe in the dream.
Okay, great. And then you also mentioned this already, but how are you finding your clubs and societies, knowing that you're engaged in both women in business as well as debate?
Yeah, so a higher level comment I might make about university societies is especially at maybe a large or top school, a lot of the clubs or societies you see are like not super active. Like they will list like 200 of them, maybe like 100 of them, or maybe 50 of them will actually be like really robust and well managed. But amongst like sort of large initiatives or large clubs, they often get like a lot of funding, a lot of resources, and a lot of opportunities that come with them. So, for example, for Women in Business, which I was admittedly a little less involved in, well, significantly less involved in compared to the debate club, it was very useful in terms of, for example, inviting people from industries to come and give talks to talk about like internship opportunities. So, for example, like Bain had a special program for like women, for women in business. And that was quite useful in terms of quote unquote networking, which is, an ugly word, but it's useful to expand your horizons and learn about opportunities you otherwise wouldn't know about. In terms of, for example, a club like Stanford Debate or clubs that are more competitive where you have like an actual team, I think it's like really lovely in terms of the sort of camaraderie or solidarity that you build between members of like the core team or like the most active members. Um, we also, in particular, get a lot of funding. So Stanford, despite being on the West Coast and most like tournaments being on the East Coast, is willing to like fly us all out for free, basically. You pay for like our meals and day-to-day costs and tournaments. It's very accessible in that way as well.
Yeah, that sounds really exciting. So I'm going to latch off of your discussion around internships. Have you been able to find any internship opportunities or work placements that you have been exploring? Because I know you're only in second year, so it's probably a lot less of a priority. But if you have been, we would be excited to know about them.
But yeah, of course. And I will say, like in many universities, the freshman year job opportunity search is probably the most brutal it will be throughout most of your years of university. Like classic dilemma of I need an internship, but I need like past experience, but I have no past experience. Like, how will I get experience? The classic paradox. But for me in particular, for the first half of my summer, I was part of like it's called the Sky Summer Study Program in China, where it's part of a department called like it's SCCEI, so the Stanford something about like Institute of like Chinese Economics. I forget exactly what the acronym stands for. But this is basically a sort of exploration as well as research program in China to learn about Chinese economics. And this is quite useful in particular, somewhat intuitively, because I had the opportunity to learn about like international econ specifically in China. And we had opportunities to talk to very important people, for example, like the CEO of Ant Group. We talked to like the vice chairman for securities in China as well as just like talking to like day-to-day people on the ground to learn about like the education systems, to look at the back of factories as well. And this was quite useful in terms of being able to understand like economics in the context of a specific country that also has many unique characteristics of its economic system. Like communism with Chinese characteristics, it often has specific like state planning and like state-owned enterprises that tend to be quite important. So that was quite useful in terms of learning about a very unique case study. Aside from that, like I'm doing some work in law and in the office. It's not super related to economics, but it's mostly just telling me that I probably should not be considering a career in law because it's a little brutal. Um, but work is work and it's good.
Yeah, that sounds great. So it definitely sounds like a lot of interdisciplinary studying going on. I love that you're enjoying everything or most things that you are currently embarking on, most endeavors. Uh, and I guess last question that sums everything up, and once again transitions beautifully from what you just mentioned. Because you are studying both the IR aspect and also the more technical aspect of economics, do you think that in terms of considering a future career, you would lean more towards one than another? And what would you envision to be doing in a few years after graduation?
Yeah, I guess in terms of the transition, it might still be law. It's looking like decreasingly likely, but it could still happen. Traditional like yes, Asians in law, but work probably is something like that type of work probably something I think I'd be good at, which is what drew me to it in the first place. But the lifestyle is a little brutal, and I'd like to extend my lifespan and not do that. In terms of like econ versus IR, I think I'd probably, well, first of all, I probably would pursue a master's or a postgrad. Maybe I would like do some work in between, but I probably would eventually. And I think I would likely lean more towards the econ aspect of it as opposed to like the politics or IR aspect of it. And this is because, well, I actually do find economics in and of itself like still pretty interesting alongside IR, but it's specifically the work itself that would be more relevant to me. So for IR, I would either end up working in a job that would basically be more suited for an econ like master's, or I would like work it for government, or I'd work in academia, which is not that appealing to me. And if I worked it for government, I would work for like the Canadian government, which isn't as like globally important. I hate to say it. So yeah, in terms of job opportunities, I think it would make more sense for me to pursue an econ master's or maybe even an MBA.
All right, yeah, that sounds like a very thought you considered and you put a lot of thought into that. And yeah, definitely broadened my personal horizons a lot and my perspective a lot. So thank you so much. And once again, thanks for coming today and sharing all of your experiences and insights with us, even during the busy time of summer when you have internships and all of these work opportunities going on.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much again for having me. I had a great time.